Dear Bats of Tomorrow, belated Happy New Year. First of all, I hope you're doing great and that you have already had a wonderful start to this year. I'm actually super excited about what will happen in the next 12 months and what surprises, adventures, maybe challenges will await me and this podcast. On the one hand, there's a lot of uncertainty in the coming time, but at the same time, it also offers, I think, the chance to find your own path and then to meet many new people, to have hopefully exciting discussions and then to learn a lot by that. In this episode, I talked to Annika Hugosson, and I've kind of met her at an online event about the animal in Warzone and was really curious about the research she had already done. That's how I ended up reading her paper about the care of magical creatures and the moral critique of the animal lover trope in Harry Potter. Annika volunteered for animals from an early age, and her interest in them has never waned. Currently, she is doing her PhD at the Department of Anthropology at the University of North Carolina, so in the US. And we take the fictional world of Harry Potter as our common thread to talk about various ethical issues in dealing with animals. In doing so, we not only talk about the possible definition of animal lovers, but also about the way we categorize animal species in general. Under what circumstances one and the same animal species is called both good and bad, and whether authors have an animal welfare responsibility to carry when writing a book. But also about how popular literature can influence children and teenagers in how they interact with animals, especially pets. Yeah, so I hope it's going to be really interesting for you and that you enjoy listening. Hello, Annika. I hope it's okay when I introduce you with your first name.
Yes, yeah. Of course.
Great. So yeah, nice to meet you. And I'm really glad that you're taking your time for this interview and we can talk to each other. So welcome to this podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I really appreciate that. Of course, I did some research about you and now I know a little bit about what you do and what you did already in the past, like that you're doing your PhD, for example, in the Department of Anthropology at the University of North Carolina, and that you also studied a lot already, and I was really impressed by that, to be honest. So but still, maybe you can tell a little bit about yourself to the listeners and tell us what you studied.
I actually studied Hispanic linguistics, so Spanish. I also studied German. Honestly, it wasn't until I had been in the workforce for a couple of years that I realized I just wasn't really fulfilled. I wanted to somehow work with animals, and I ended up dabbling in veterinary medicine for a couple of years as well, thinking maybe I wanted to do that, but I didn't find out I could really study animals until I reached out to a nonprofit. They take dogs from animal shelters and train them for conservation-focused causes, so anti-poaching missions, things like that. And I was just one day at work, I was so frustrated, and I reached out to them. I said, if I just wanted to start over and do something like this, like what would you advise? And they told me about the master's program in anthrozoology at Canisius College. So that's where I found that kind of a viable path to studying animals. And through that program, I arrived at an anthropology program where I could focus on animal studies. So yeah, kind of a roundabout way of getting here, but I'm glad to be here, yes.
But what made you, in the first place, really interested in animal welfare or like just working with animals?
From a young age, my mom probably, I wanted to work with animals from a young age. And really when you're a child and you express interest in animals, everyone says, oh, you'll be a veterinarian. I don't know, maybe I will someday still. Who knows where life will go. But I didn't really enjoy the natural sciences so much. I was more interested in kind of thinking and writing about animals, and that's how I came to approach it from a social sciences perspective. But I would say from my mom, because I grew up volunteering in animal shelters. So I remember one of my earliest memories is a litter of small puppies came in and they were covered in fleas, and I was probably, 10 or 12 years old, and I was helping comb fleas off of these puppies, and I just thought, wow, this is amazing that I have the opportunity to help. And I'm not sure if you saw that I came from shelters, so I worked in an animal shelter just before I began my PhD at the same time I was completing my master's. And so I would say certainly my experience as a child gave me a great empathy in particular for animals in shelters, and definitely affected my academic trajectory as well.
So it started from a really young age and had a really big impact on you.
Yes, definitely.
And then later on, you mentioned already the volunteer work. So what exactly were you doing there?
When I was just a little, I couldn't walk big dogs, so maybe I would walk with my mom when she was walking large dogs. Mostly I hung out with the cats and socialized with the cats because, just a child in the animal shelter. And so I had to make sure, of course, I was like abiding by their rules and being safe. So, and then I did though, say once I was an adult, I continued to volunteer in animal shelters and walked dogs, socialized dogs, kind of helping where I could, depending on what the needs of the shelter were. And then what I ended up doing when I worked at an animal shelter in my city was I was the volunteer manager, and I also helped with rescue networking as well as the foster programs.
Oh, wow. So you then moved on to the managing field.
Yeah.
Impressive. Are you still doing the volunteer work while doing your PhD, or do you needed to stop that?
I mostly have stopped, but I also recently adopted a puppy. This is actually my first puppy. I've always adopted adult dogs and been an advocate for doing that because in a lot of ways, it's a bit easier. So at this point in my life right now, I'm really focused on training and working through positive reinforcement training with my young puppy. She's almost 6 months. And so she's my focus right now as I build her up. So I haven't been able to volunteer as much, but certainly it's something I want to do. Like, for example, I fostered her and I have fostered some other dogs. And so it allows me to have a dog at home, who I'm still helping, even if I can't have the schedule capacity to get in the shelter as much as I want.
Yeah, I happened to read one of your articles that you wrote already now about a couple of years ago, and this is also now the main topic that we want to talk about, like the moral critique of animal lover as a trope, and specifically in the books of Harry Potter. So that was like a new approach to the books for me, and I was really surprised by like rethinking and remembering the books that I was reading when I was a child. It just blew me away when I was reading your article. So first, thank you for that.
Thank you so much for saying that. I'm so pleased that someone even read it, let alone that it resonated in some way,
It was really cool because, when you're a child, you're reading the books, you're so, you're in this world of the Harry Potter, in this fictional world. And of course, you have this child perspective. And I think we are also later going to talk about this, what kind of impact fictional work can have on children, especially, and how important it is then to think about what kind of impact it can be, or it should be maybe. So that was really interesting and fascinating for me to think of myself again and try to remember what I was thinking back then, and now to have also with the knowledge that I have now received through going to uni and stuff like that, to have a completely new perspective. Yeah, it's really cool that this article, your article, was the reason to think again about this topic. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the article and tell us briefly what it is about.
Of course, yeah. So you introduced it quite well, and really that was how I came to write this. I haven't spoken much as of yet about what my research is now, but this was never related to anything I was working on in school. In fact, my advisor wasn't really pleased that I was working on this paper on the side rather than the research I was supposed to be focusing on. So it's a new avenue for me, but it's exactly as you said. I was rereading. It had been years since I had read fiction, and I wanted to take a break from all of this academic reading, and I thought, well, it's been a few years. Let's reread Harry Potter. It's, a series that, like so many millions of others in the world, has brought me so much joy. It was a formative part of my childhood, in the same way that I've just talked to you about how volunteering in the animal shelter stuck with me. I mean, again, I grew up with these books. So I thought, it's been a while. Let me take some fun, and it was summer. I was like, let me reread these. And as you said, I've had these experiences of going to uni. I think I was done with my studies in anthropology at the time. I think I was just transitioning to this PhD program, but had been doing all of this reading about animal ethics and, I don't know, animal ethology, like all of these diverse interdisciplinary topics. And I've been a vegetarian since I was very young, since I was 10, because my mom was too. And then I have since transitioned to being vegan. So anyway, as you said, we're in this world of Harry Potter when we're reading these books, right? And so I was reading these books and I was thinking, well, what if I were at Hogwarts? What would I eat? And this is just kind of silly things to think about, but like when you look at the wand cores, I don't think there are any that I can bring to mind that don't involve some piece of an animal body. We have a lot of descriptions from these feasts in the Great Hall that not only are they, assembled and cooked and prepared by house elves, which is a different topic altogether, as we're talking about kind of these delineations of species and of beings, right? But there's these lavish descriptions of, excesses of meat and cream and all this rich food. When you are entering the classroom, you have animals used as subjects that you are transfiguring and converting. And, these are points of humor in the text that maybe you have botched and this I think is taking the visual from the movie rather than the book, but like converting a rat into a goblet and the goblet still has a tail. This is a point of humor. And that's really what struck me. Again, imagining myself as a vegan or vegetarian, or maybe just, take off the titles and imagine yourself there as someone who doesn't really want to have, I don't know, a dragon heartstring in your wand core, right? How was that procured? How were these tail feathers of phoenixes procured? Is it done in a way that's ethical? Is it done in a way that doesn't harm the animal? Seeing that so constantly, I literally would be turning a page of the book and I would sit there like with my head, I'm describing myself because we're in a podcast. So I would sit with my hand on my chin and I would pause and I would think, wow, like I don't remember all of this when I was reading it. And I've always been, quote unquote, a kid who loves animals, but I was being socialized to these really sometimes more explicit displays of, using animals in all these different ways. And it really gave me pause. And so again, you introduced it very well. This is really what my reaction was too, as I reread it. And so I thought I want to write through some of these more interesting kind of points of inquiry.
It's really interesting that you mentioned already like so many different topics that you also mentioned in the article then. One of the things that like first struck me, I think, was to categorize the non-humans into groups. And then also because we have the same discussion now in like our world, quote unquote, like how do we want to categorize? Can we do that? And like, what did you see in the books? Like, what way did J.K. Rowling used to find a way to categorize the non-humans?
She did it in a few ways, and forgive me because now it's a bit rusty, and so this might be a part where we are chopping it up a little bit. So forgive me in advance. But she does that in a few ways, again, ways that are more explicit and ways that are more latent. So for example, in J.K. Rowling writing as Newt Scamander, there are textbooks, there are guides, and so there are literally taxonomies of magical creatures that we can see. And maybe again, we will talk about this more, this delineation between beast and being. And these are also terms that carry connotations in the language we use today, outside of this fictional universe. Where beast, even actually when I was writing this piece, one of the first comments of the editor wrote back and said, beasts, ? Like, that's not a word that we use. That's not a word that we use even in this journal. And I explained, this is a purposeful use of that language to correspond with these fictional categories of beast versus being, where really the primary difference between those two discrete categories is moral consideration. And so there are a few ways that Rowling sets up these categories, but another thing that we might, again, talk about in a bit through the course of our conversation is the fact that these are not static categories. certain species, certain animals, certain categories of animals can definitely move in between them. And that's what I think is very interesting. That's where it gets really messy. And that's why I wanted to write through it. Like, as part of my thought process, I had so many questions, and I wanted to write through some of these and kind of interrogate where and how and why certain boundaries came to be.
Yeah, I think one of the ways how we, like in the real world, we try to categorize because it's the easy way, is to say, okay, these are the good ones and the other must be the bad ones. So we have the classification of, like, I would say, non-human animals in either being good, like good animals, and then we have the bad ones that we don't want, we don't like, I don't know, especially insects, like usually the ones that we don't really like, spiders. These are the animals that I can think of now in our real world, and I think J.K. Rowling also uses the same thing in her books. Like, there are things and beings that are categorized as bad because they harm each other or other beings. And then we have the good ones that, especially they are good because they help the wizard. So they are helpful and they have a purpose and they can fulfill something. And because of that, they are regarded as good. But this is like, there are only two categories. You can be either or, nothing in between, really. From a, like the moral perspective, what do you think is the advantage maybe of that, but also the disadvantage?
I actually would say there is still traveling between these two and that's where this imperialist idea comes in. That's also inherently an anthropocentric view, where there's this idea that society either has the right or the duty to conquer or take control of other classes of beings or other classes of humans. Obviously, imperialism is rooted in a very real human process, but there are also imperialist ideas that kind of come from this overall ideology. So I think that's where ideas come in, where we have maybe bad animals, but they might be good insofar as they can be used toward a certain goal, which again is a very anthropocentric viewpoint, very speciesist viewpoint. You know, we can drop all these buzzwords here and see where they converge on these ideas of usefulness. You know, how useful is this bad animal? Why is this quote unquote good animal useful? Is this quote unquote good animal good to look at? There is a lot of literature written, authored regarding kind of imperialist ideologies in zoos. So kind of the collectability of so-called exotic animals, these royal menageries of years past that we still kind of see persistent in certain qualities of zoos today, where maybe a bad animal is good to look at if we are separate, if the animal is there for us to gaze at, but that's it. Or if the animal is there to perform, like in the sense of entertainment. And another thing that I've recently explored through writing was on snakes and kind of the usefulness of snakes in particular, but generally reptile bodies, as being useful insofar as they can be used for fashion and entertainment. But we don't want to see there's these intense phobias of snakes and snake bodies in their living form. That's really just neutralized. It's mitigated through their death and through their reconfiguration into animal or into human clothing, human accessories, that also kind of trivializes that fear that was once there. So that's where it gets really blurry and really interesting, because you have these ideas of good and bad, but they can be converted through neutralizing the animal, either through the confines of captivity, through killing the animal and using their body for a specific purpose, or again, like in the case of some of these case studies in Harry Potter, where they're put in these fantastical situations, but are nevertheless still under control and only being used for maybe a very finite or discrete purpose.
You already said the word or the phrase anthropocentric view. Could you please just explain like the definition of this view, and maybe also if we are still using this nowadays, or if not, if we have other views that we can use to look at non-human animals?
I think we are definitely still using it these days. I think it's really ingrained. I mean, you said earlier that, we're primed. We kind of have this precondition to categorize the world around us. And I think that's one of the key foundations giving rise to anthropocentrism, which I should have had a better definition prepared coming into this, but anthropocentrism is really just this idea of foregrounding the human experience, or assuming that the human experience of the world is the one that's most important, whereas the antonym or the opposite of anthropocentrism would either be zoocentrism or biocentrism, which is taking either kind of this, I don't know, like the perspective of the entire biological world as being more important, maybe more valid. I mean, these are really still really highly subjective ideas. Or like zoocentrism, which is taking the animal experience. What I really want to say too on this, where we're talking definition wise, is this is all foregrounded on a really precarious and problematic idea that humans and animals are separate. Humans are animals. So by me continuously saying human and animal, I mean, when I write, I would offer some sort of caveat, or I would make sure to say, when I say human and animal, it's for sake of brevity, but I would, actually specify non-human animals, or I would offer some sort of qualification, because all of these ideas that we're talking about are already flawed in the sense that, well, they're already flawed, but they're flawed further in the sense that human and animals are, like, that separation is socially constructed and constantly socially and culturally reified. It's not necessarily a real thing, but it certainly persists in human thought. And again, that allows anthropocentrism to persist. I think there's a sort of a natural quality to it though as well, because we are humans. We are here, you and I, we're communicating through human language. We're talking about non-human animals, but we ourselves are humans talking on a podcast for humans. So like, of course there's going to be some kind of underlying current of that, because that is our species, right? But assuming that kind of the human use of an animal is more important than that animal's, right to agency, right to life, right to a life of freedom, from pain, of suffering, things like this. That's where it becomes more of an ethical question too.
Yeah, it really struck me, like, when you realize that you're always, like, I don't know, like, I think the words animals and humans, like, us and them, as separated groups for more than 25 years or so. And nowadays I try to teach myself to use the words, or like remind myself to use the words, yeah, we are also animals as a species. We are just one of thousands and millions.
Right.
So it's really interesting to get this change in using words, because words have so much power because it expresses what we think, and it has an impact on all the other people around us that are listening to us. So yeah, it's really fascinating to see the changes of using these words in society as well, and then in articles or like in research as well.
And there's also an interesting idea that I would throw out if anyone is interested in reading more into this idea of empathetic anthropomorphism. So anthropomorphism is attributing quote unquote human characteristics to non-human animals. And there's a lot of debate about the usefulness and how generative this can be in, nurturing empathy and compassion for non-human animals, because it frames non-human animals in human terms. So, wow, like this animal is as smart as a 4-year-old child. I mean, that's a great example where we are therefore like attributing maybe questions of how we should care for a certain animal versus another on the basis that they are as intelligent as a human child. There's also a lot embedded in that, which implies that they have more capacity for reason, for suffering, things like that. And so that is another interesting idea that bleeds into topics of anthropocentrism, which is kind of framing animals in very human terms and likening them to us. Just another interesting connection to make, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So we had now the differentiation between good and bad. And another one that Rowling is using is, and yeah, I think you also already mentioned this, is the one between beings and beasts. Do you remember, like, what exactly is the differentiation?
No, I could look. I could look. Sorry. I was revisiting these questions beforehand and like had a few things pulled up, but I don't remember exactly what it was beyond what you wrote.
I think the thing was beings are the ones with legal rights.
Yes.
And then the governmental power. So I think beings are the creature that are like worthy of the legal rights, and then the beasts have no legal rights, and they can be possessed like things and traded and controlled. So in Germany, for example, we have the law that animals are in the law not exactly things, but they are, or regarding to the law, they are treated as things, even though they aren't. It's kind of confusing, and I think here it's the same. Like, beasts are the ones that can be possessed and that you can buy them and stuff like that. And then beings have some kind of rights. And then it's the question, like, who is allowed, or who can categorize them? Putting one thing in a box and another in the other one.
That I don't know. I don't know who has authority to categorize them, though I assume it would lie with like the governing bodies of the magical world, somewhere in the Ministry of Magic. Someone is deeming this. I can pull up my paper too and see where I cited that, because there was someone who wrote like a very interesting paper that I cited a few times throughout that writing, that they kind of went through. I think it was their master's thesis that they went through and really dissected these taxonomies a bit. But like, for example, as we're trying to like pull this up, where did I find this? There was like some debate on a Wikipedia page that ghosts, it says it is the ministry. Okay, so the ministry is who's classifying these. It says ghosts are very sensitive about their condition. When the ministry initially classified them as sentient creatures with full legal rights, they claimed that the term was insensitive and received a separate, quote, spirit division to apparently control the activities and haunting of locations of troublesome ghosts. So here, there's this separate spirit division that's been created on the insistence of the quote-unquote creatures themselves, after appealing to the Ministry of Magic. And what is important about ghosts in this case, in the Harry Potter universe, is only wizards and witches, I believe, are able to become ghosts. So they must have been human, and they must have been magical humans at some point to enter this spirit division in the afterlife. So that's an interesting tidbit here. And maybe that's something that we can include. Sorry, I'm not, I told you a podcast is new for me, so I'm like, how much of this can we have like as candid off the cuff here?
Yeah, it's interesting for me because in our laws, and I mean, of course, like worldwide, there are so many different countries and so many different laws, and what kind of rules rules we use to categorize the beings that we have, like the humans and non-human animals, because for certain non-human animals, we assume that they have kind of rights, but do we say, okay, they need to have pain, they need to be able to suffer, and then there is this need to protect them, so we need to give them some kind of rights? Or do we say, yeah, for example, they need to be as smart as a 4-year-old kid? So for me, it was interesting to think about the relation between the book, like how is it done there, and what are we doing in our world, in the Western world, I would say, because I can relate more to the Western one because I grew up there, and this is the world that I know the most about. Where would you say where is the relation between those two worlds, like the fictional one and the books, and how it is done with the categorization of being and beasts? So like the humans that are worthy enough to have rights to protect them and their well-being, and then things, and it's a question, are animals in our world also things, and they are called in the book, in the fictional world, beasts?
I don't know if this exactly answers your question, but I had kind of a thread of thought I wanted to follow from earlier in your question, which was like how much of this is translated to our human world. And I think it's another like very important point that is very like obvious, but maybe something important to restate, which is of course that just as you said, you grew up in the Western world, so did I, and so did J.K. Rowling. And so she's writing too, even though she's completely crafting this sort of new world. I mean, obviously we have Muggle world bleeding in at various points, and we still have this relationship of being of the same species. So though some are wizarding people, some are magical, and some are not. Obviously it's very much, the book is so relatable because of this kind of translatability, this how relative things can be. But I think, and this is something that I read many, many years ago in one of my first forays into animal studies, which was reading Hal Herzog's book, Some We Love, Some We Eat, Some We Hate. I may have gotten the ordering of that title a bit wrong. And I think the subtitle of it is Why It's So Hard to Think Straight About Animals. And there's a passage there where Herzog details a study looking at the phylogenetic scale and finding that people, for example, I believe these are people working in laboratories that might be experimenting on different species of animals. Some people struggled with testing on mice, for instance. These are mammals. We can see a little bit of ourselves in them, in the fact that we are both mammalian species. Maybe we are able to see their eyes. Maybe we are able to hear their vocalizations and at some level detect discomfort or recognize fear, pain. But when you get to the level of crustaceans, insects, animals that are so different from humans in really every conceivable way, certainly snakes as well, they just look really different from us, and genetically they're quite different from us. There is this separation in the mind that once you go so far away from your own kind of branch of the phylogenetic tree, that it's easier to distance oneself from maybe the mental life of that animal. I don't know if that really answers what you were getting at.
No, it's a good addition. Yeah, I think it's an endless thing. Like, there are so many things connected to that. And once you start thinking of breaking all these categorizations, and especially to analyze yourself, like your own thinking, because you already said this. It's about who can I relate the most to. And mammals are the easiest one, because I can try to put some emotions onto them, because maybe their facial expression is something that it looks a bit similar to the humans that I know, like how they look when they're angry or happy or whatever. But with a snake, for example, or especially with a snake, like the skin is so attached to the bones, there is not that much movement in the face. It's almost impossible to say, okay, this being or this snake might be afraid right now. And without the emotional connection, I think it's very difficult for human beings to have empathy at all. Yeah, I think that's one of the problems that we have here.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, but going back to the Harry Potter books and then the trope of the animal lover, because the so-called animal lover also needs a lot of empathy, or we assume that it needs a lot of that. What would you say is exactly an animal lover, like the perfect animal lover, or what is the definition that society maybe has right now about the quote-unquote animal lover?
It's a great question, and I've been thinking about it, and I don't know the answer, but I think it's really fun to think about. For example, and again, we're straying a bit from Harry Potter, we're deviating just a little bit, but thinking about what an animal lover is, and then we can kind of use that to reapply to this fictional world or any number of others. Yeah, what is an animal lover? It's a really rich question. I would love to survey 100 people on the street and ask them what they say. When you look at, for example, vegan or vegetarianism campaigns, one of the really common arguments is like, how can you love one but eat the other? Do you really love animals if you eat them? Do you really love animals if you wear them? Do you just love the idea of animals? Do you love some animals? And if only some, which ones and why? So you're going to get a million different answers. And you asked what my definition would be. I don't even know. For example, yesterday I wore faux fur, and my mom was asking me about it. And before I purchased this, first of all, I meticulously researched the brand to make sure that this was an ethical company, treating their employees ethically, manufacturing ethically, all of this, right? But then I was still thinking, why still wear faux fur and emulate, an inherently violent, extractive process? There's this argument again that by wearing faux fur, you're kind of eschewing this idea of wearing fur in the first place. Like, I can wear what I want without killing an animal for it. When on the other hand, it's like, are you just perpetuating, the violence of the fur industry? So even yesterday, this is not something that I intended to do, but I had this kind of debate inside of my own head. Well, it's like, am I an animal lover if I've worn faux fur? Am I an animal lover if I wear faux leather or real leather? Like, I don't know what an animal lover is, even for me. And I think that if you ask people, they would give different answers. But the fact that Hagrid in these books is absolutely kind of, if you asked those same 100 people on the street and all of them happen to have read Harry Potter, like, oh, who's the animal lover in Harry Potter? I'm sure that they would say, almost unanimously, they would say Hagrid, because that's how he's written, that's how he's designed, that's how he's characterized. He's this like lovable guy who is so big, and sometimes he's blundering and he can be a bit clumsy, but he has this soft spot for non-human animals, even for the ones that nobody else really seems to care for. But then, and this is why I titled my paper the quote unquote care of magical creatures, because it really raises a lot of questions too about what it means to care for animals. And this was something that I did carry in from anthropology, where care is a word that I think we often take for granted as having maybe a universalized definition, but what care is can look and be very different depending on the context, depending on the culture, depending on the people, depending on who's administering care and who's receiving care. So care can look very different, which means that being an animal lover certainly can look very different. So yeah, that's not a very satisfying answer. It's a really long answer that doesn't say much, but suffice to say, like, it's extremely variable, which again is what makes it interesting. Though, of course, if in my paper, I would say that Hagrid might be painted or perceived as an animal lover, but I don't know that he really is.
Maybe you can really explain it a bit more in detail. Like, what made you think that Hagrid is actually not the animal lover? Because you described all the features, the big guy who has like this soft spot, and he has also like this pet animal who's the same, like it's a really big dog, but it's a crybaby kind of. It's the perfect way to, and I think you used the word that they are the definition of masculinity from the outside, but they have like this really soft feature as well and characteristic. Of course, it's a fictional thing, so it's made up to create a specific emotion for the reader, and it worked, obviously. But yeah, what exactly made you think that that's absolutely not true, and like the so-called care is maybe done at some points in a really, really wrong way and has absolutely nothing to do with animal welfare or maybe animal rights?
Again, I kind of had a thread to follow, and then
it's so cool because I can see you thinking. I know. It's written on your head, like, okay, where are my thoughts going? They are going left and right.
They are. Because you have great questions, and so I just want to make sure I answer every piece of them. Earlier in the question you said kind of what made me think that maybe Hagrid wasn't an animal lover, at least in the way that I would define it, even though as we've already discussed, I don't have any firm definition of this. Maybe I just have bits and pieces of, if I wanted to make a bulleted list, like an animal lover does this and doesn't do this. But again, like there's this fluidity, of course.
Yeah.
And I would also argue that ultimately it doesn't matter so much what we label and categorize things, but like it's going to happen anyway, which is why we're here talking about this today. I was so bothered, again, in retrospect, by Hagrid being the animal guy. He's the animal guy of the book. maybe Hermione is a little bit in that she had this soft spot for Crookshanks and, stood up for Crookshanks in, defending when Crookshanks was going after Ron's rat, also Pettigrew. You could say, and also for her campaign for house elf welfare. So certainly she's in there as well, but Hagrid is the one who throughout, one of the consistencies of how his character is that he's the animal guy. Like, oh, there's an animal concern. Let's call Hagrid. We need animals bred for weaponry in the Triwizard Tournament. Like, let's call Hagrid. We need dragons trained to aggress toward, or we need dragons here to aggress toward our students in this tournament. Like, let's call Hagrid. He's the animal guy. He's the animal lover. He's the one who would have, a soft spot for these strong and scaly animals, the dragons. His weakness in the first book was having this, his weakness in the first book was that he could be kind of hoodwinked with this dragon's egg, because something he had always wanted was to have a dragon. But of course, did he really think through the implications of this? And so I think, part of the problem, and I don't mean to fully only critique Hagrid, I think part of his lovability is just this fact that he is, that he thinks first of, the excitement, maybe the challenge of the animal without thinking through the consequence. He does this in the dragon situation. Yeah, there's this almost juvenile, childlike quality to him. And maybe that's also why so many of us, maybe as children, could really see ourselves in Hagrid. Like, again, when I was reading it, I was like, oh, I really vibe with Hagrid. Like, that's who I would be. I was the kid who, when I was little, I was like fascinated by ants, and I would lie outside for like an hour and watch ants. So I could see some of this in Hagrid, certainly. And I don't want to paint him as a villain, but I do want to problematize the fact that so many of his behaviors in regard to animals and how he used animals in the classroom, in, providing them for certain tasks and situations in which they would certainly be harmed, or at least would be put in place to be harmed. The fact that Fluffy, this big 3-headed dog, would be just indefinitely confined to a dark room, really, the choice of using a dog for that situation is really interesting, because of course Fluffy is described as being quite vicious. Fluffy has 3 heads, so Fluffy isn't like the dogs that we have in our own homes necessarily, but this is still likened to a dog, which is a species that arguably above any other we empathize with in the Western world. And so that's an interesting choice. And then when you think, if someone in a non-fantasy world had a dog guarding a trap door in a dark room indefinitely, like, how would we read that? Certainly we would raise concerns about that, right? So he's the animal guy. He's providing animals for any number of reasons, but I don't know that he is necessarily loving them beyond the fact that animals can be useful or collectible or, interesting and fun to look at.
I think you also, in the article, you described Hagrid or his actions as one of a species. So what exactly does this mean, like being a species?
There are a few different definitions of speciesism, so it's still kind of something that's hotly talked about in philosophy. So there are a few different operational ideas of what this is, but it is kind of just regarding, again, conferring and really subscribing to this idea of species being a really important category, first of all, giving differential treatment to different species based on, certain prejudices, certain biases that we may have, having similar interests. And so it's something that we've kind of been dancing around a little bit in the conversation, but speciesism is, again, kind of foregrounding ideas of species membership, first of all, and then either very blatantly, or even in some ways it's more latent, offering differential or preferential treatment to certain species over others. It's often seen, again, in veganism or vegetarianism campaigns. There's a very famous picture where you have a portrait cut in half and you have a dog's face on one side and a pig or maybe a cow's face on the other side. And again, it's that question of why love one but eat the other. And then again, here we have the same thing happening where we have arguments about pigs' intelligence or pigs' relative intelligence vis-a-vis dogs. And it tries to put this relatable spin on pigs where people are questioning eating them, well, if they're like my dog at home. And so that's one kind of hallmark example of speciesism. And then a speciesist would be a person who really subscribes to these ideas. So again, like there's debate about whether we are attributing this title of speciesist to everyone, assuming that it's kind of pre-programmed in the human condition, or if it's something that because it's a very, very heavy connotative term, like are we really reserving term speciesist to apply to people who are really intentionally or really particularly involved in kind of practices of exploitation?
Yeah, another thing, like Hagrid uses this categorization, or not only Hagrid, but I think all the people there at Hogwarts, actually. But then, like what struck me not the most, but one of the things that struck me was the example with the dragons. Because Hagrid, you mentioned this, that he wanted to have like a dragon for years, that he was like looking forward to it, to have one and to raise one. And then he gets this one egg. I think he wins it actually, which is also very questionable. And then he raises this baby dragon in a way where it's not safe for him and the dragon kind of, and then also for the students. And at the same time, the same species is being used in this tournament. And you have like this one species, but they are being treated in different ways, depending on if it's a pet animal, like this baby dragon that he's raising, and the other, they are used, like in a fun game. Depending on the perspective, it's a fun game. What do you think about that?
I think that's unfortunately something that we can see reflected in a lot of different facets of society. So, I mean, certainly again with, fish. Fish are animals that some keep as pets. They may also eat fish. The fact that you can go to an aquarium and admire the beauty and the natural beauty of these fish, but then maybe you will go to the aquarium restaurant and they'll be serving seafood in this kind of, almost kind of a perverted kind of convergence of animal domination, right? I think you can see it, and I mean, this is debated with like respect to dogs who are competing in dog sports, questions of whether they want to be doing it or not. Certainly, like I do agility with my dogs, and so I'm not saying that dog sports are evil at all. I'm talking more about like greyhound racing or dogs that are bred for the purposes of running. Horse racing is obviously another really questionable ethical example. Bullfighting, rodeos, things like that, where maybe an individual animal is being used in very different ways, and maybe also sometimes being kept as a pet, especially with the case of dogs, not so much with horses or with bulls. Animal testing too is where you have a lot of interesting things happening because dogs in the US, at least, it's really dwindling, but there are still dogs being used for animal testing. But also non-human primates are being used for animal testing. And so it's really interesting to see the like a divergence where maybe a specific like breed of stock is used, and I don't like using those terms, but maybe a specific line of this animal is being used toward use in laboratories, and another line of this animal is being used for pet. Again, it's very interesting to think about, how do we separate ourselves? How can we justify this? What are the steps in kind of cognitive dissonance that are taken to allow this to continuously happen? For example, in laboratories, like how would someone working in a laboratory be able to, perform experiments and then maybe go home to a pet dog? Like, how does that happen? Like, how do we navigate that in the mind? I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm not being, purposefully, blunt here. I'm really curious about that process, kind of navigating that mentally. I'm not sure if that answers kind of our dragon question, but.
Another thing that was really interesting for me, because in the book, they are also calling Hagrid as the expert for animals during the tournament. And they are particularly cruel to the dragons in the tournament. They suffer, they definitely get harmed. And you think also watching the movies, you can assume that some of them also die. So it's also about death. It's not only about being harmed.
So here's, I think, the difference between like having the companion and the subject. Would you say that this is something we are getting closer in our society, in our real world, to get rid of those separation? Like, do you see a change in society?
I don't know. You're asking, is there a difference? Are we seeing the lines being more blurred now? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
It might be. I mean, that would be something I want to think about a bit more, because I wonder if it's getting blurrier, or if this line more generally between human and animal might be getting blurrier in a way that's productive toward better conditions for non-human animals. Like, for example, you in the EU, like I won't be able to speak to this probably as well as you can, but there are certain EU level protections in place. As you said too, in Germany in particular, there are specific laws that, you explained it before and I can't remember how it was specifically, but that, I think that you said that animals in Germany are still in some ways treated as property. However, they are also sentient.
Yeah.
So maybe we have new kind of legal categories being created, in some ways, which then kind of ends up inevitably transferring, or, the order that this happens, it's probably happening at the same time. There's like ideological shifts in how we might perceive other animals as well. And so I don't know though. It's like the question there is like, well, what if you have laws in place? That's great, but are they being reliably enforced? Are they actually, going to result in kind of generational shifts toward more humane treatment for animals? I think that remains to be seen.
Another thing that was interesting for me that you mentioned the exotic animals, and dragons are one of the also exotic animals within the fictional world, related to the real world, about keeping exotic animals as companions and how dangerous this can be or might be. So what is your perspective and your thoughts about keeping an animal, or like to give the children that are reading those books, showing them a way of keeping an exotic dragon animal in that way, and what they might think of having their own exotic animal? Because, for example, I know that, especially in the UK, after the books were released or published, the numbers of kids having owls as pets increased.
Yeah, and this is something we see more widely reflected in popular media in general. So other examples, you mentioned the owls, a spike in owls, and not even with exotic pets, but with certain breeds of dogs. 101 Dalmatians saw an explosion in people wanting Dalmatians as pets. The movie Hachi with Richard Gere, which features an extremely loyal Akita. This is based on a true story from Japan of a dog who waited for his deceased owner at the train station for years and is memorialized today in Japan. That led to an explosion of people wanting Akitas. When I worked in the animal shelter, worked with Akita rescues quite often, because in the times that we didn't get Akitas into the shelter so often. But we would get a few a year, and I talked to them. I asked them about this. I said, what was the result of this movie? And they said, oh my gosh, the demand, we saw a surge in Akitas coming into, we saw a surge of Akitas coming into our rescue because so many people purchased them without really understanding what they were getting into. I don't like to generalize breeds of dogs, but they are known to be quote unquote stubborn and more difficult to train. And so people would purchase them for this aspiration of having this incredibly loyal dog and then not really realizing what they were getting into. So even before we get to exotic, we can see this happen with other, media, movies, and entertainment, which create new demand for new pets. In the US, obviously there are very real implications for having certain pets in terms of concern for humans. Believe it or not, North Carolina, where I live, but there are other states in the US as well where you can legally have a lion, a tiger. Some states you don't even need to have a license. So you could have a tiger and not tell your neighbor. I volunteered at Carolina Tiger Rescue, which is quite near my house, and so many of those tigers, lions, other big cats, and then other animals like kinkajous, trying to think of any other species there, but so many of those came from private ownership where, again, people might have purchased an exotic pet that they found for any number of reasons they couldn't handle anymore. One of my favorite tigers, who has since passed away, was kept in a backyard in South Carolina and was surrendered to the rescue when she was experiencing health complications that her owner, though her owner loved her very much, they couldn't find a veterinarian who would come and treat this backyard tiger, of course. So obviously there are human concerns. There have even been cases in Texas not so long ago. A young Bengal tiger was roaming in a suburban neighborhood, and fortunately someone had their gun trained to shoot this tiger. Fortunately, the owner came and said, "That is my tiger. Let me take her and restrain her." But she could have died. I mean, these are just coming immediately to the top of my head. There are so many stories of this where, of course, human concerns are at play. But when we want to talk, I mean, it becomes an endless story when we want to talk about how complicated this is for the animals themselves. Are we able to ever, provide the proper conditions for some animals to thrive and really, live full lives as pets? And it completely depends on the species and a ton of other factors, right? But ethically, it's very dubious. It's even dubious when we think about dogs and cats. But when you get into exotic, there's a whole host of other questions. And so there are a number of dangers for humans and pets in these cases. Yeah.
What is your personal view of a book? How much should considered about the possible influence that a book can have on children or teenagers? Because both of us had now the experience of reading this as a child or a young teenager, the Harry Potter series, and not thinking about this because we were without knowledge. Now we have a different knowledge, a new perspective. But do you think it's necessary that the author is also taking care of or considering this?
Yeah, but I would like to say yes, but at the same time,
It's really difficult. I was talking to some friends the other day, and they said, "Yeah, but honestly, I know your arguments, but at the same time, I just want to enjoy the book."
Exactly.
Into that world and just forget the real one, and then at that moment, you don't want to think about all the ethical problems that you might face in this world, like in the fictional one. So they just honestly told me, "I don't care."
No, exactly. You're exactly right. That's why I was almost a little frustrated when I wanted to escape through reading these again. And I kept pausing and having these kind of debates with myself as I was rereading these books.
Yeah.
Because no, you're exactly right. We want to escape. It's exhausting. It is exhausting to constantly have in our mind, how every little thing we do each day, how I don't know, the impossibilities of consuming ethically under capitalism. I mean, we would drive ourselves crazy, and it would be really, really difficult to subsist and survive and live in any sort of happy way if that's all we're thinking about. Certainly, I think it would be, I don't know. I think it would be ridiculous to suggest that Rowling should have done things extremely drastically different in terms of all that I'm arguing here. I just wanted to problematize it. I just wanted to suggest that we need to consume critically any forms of media that we are enjoying, that we're reproducing. It doesn't mean that we necessarily need to change it, but we should consume it critically, and we should reflect on how there can and are real implications for how we consume fictional worlds. Yeah. But it's also in the case of your friends, and I'm sure any number of people who would read, papers like this or papers like mine, it's really easy to also just dismiss it and say, well, it's not real, it doesn't matter. But it still does. It still exists. It's still something that we're taking and carrying with us in our minds, even if we don't always see the ways it manifests in the real world.
Something that interests me in particular, because I'm going to be a vet next year, what kind of thoughts or what kind of consequences should I take from your article, and then also from reanalyzing the books now for maybe my future work? Are there some things that you might give me as an advice for my first job that I will hopefully start next year?
I think we owe it to animals we keep as pets and then animals that veterinarians care for to do a little more to understand animal ethology, animal behavior, animal communication. And that means, for instance, like I'm seeing some ripples and some changes. For example, in the US, there is a new certification program, fear-free certification that veterinary professionals or entire veterinary practices can have that says they have undertaken training and understand less confinement-based methods for handling animals when they're coming into veterinary care, trying less invasive methods. I also think it means owners of pets practicing cooperative care, which is practicing at home for nail trims, socializing your dog and your cat to a nail trimmer, getting them comfortable and having them have positive associations with having their ears and their mouth touched, their paws touched, so that when they do go to the veterinarian, they are experiencing perhaps a little less discomfort with those conditions. You can even, something that I would recommend, not necessarily to you as a veterinarian, but in general, I would recommend owners taking pets for just like a dry run at the veterinarian. Mm-hmm. If it's something that's offered, bring them in. They don't get a shot. They don't have any strange people hovering around them. They just get a lot of treats in a veterinary exam room and then they leave. And so this is something that's recommended by positive dog trainers as well. But for veterinarians, I think recognizing that a bit better, it really depends. I think a lot of people in society see veterinarians as the experts in animal everything, not just animal medicine, but animal behavior. And that puts a burden on vets who are already extremely overworked, are extremely knowledgeable in having to study multiple species and perform, medicine on dogs, cats, and perhaps a whole host of other species, depending on their specialty. But because veterinarians carry this burden of being these experts in society, they need to recognize that and carry with them some more basic knowledge of animal behavior. And I say that because there have been occasions where I've been in veterinarian offices as an employee or as a client bringing my dog as a patient where, they didn't necessarily recognize clear signs of fear that my dog was exhibiting. And it made the experience worse for everyone. I wish that there were more built into veterinary curricula across the world. Again, I don't know much about it outside of the US, but I wish there were more built in to consider animal communication so that when these animals as patients are coming in, we can serve them better. Yeah, in times of stress, duress, illness.
You're absolutely right with saying there are, I think, several situations during a vet life where you don't know enough because there's so much to know about all those species and you don't know enough about every single one that you create or you allow a really stressful situation both for the dog or the pet and the owner and also for yourself actually because you are as a vet are in the situation and you could have done it in a better way if you would have known more, like would have read the animal the non-human animal in a better way.
Yeah, no, I would also say, oh no, I had a thought and I lost it.
It's coming back.
Oh my gosh. No, it will come back. Sorry. No, I had another thought about something that you said.
So frustrating for yourself. Is your thought coming back?
Yes, it's starting to, because we were talking about the burdens on veterinarians, especially if society kind of burdens them again with this assumption that they're all animal lovers. Something that I saw arise on multiple occasions when I worked at an emergency veterinary hospital. So we unfortunately saw a lot of acute distress. Yeah. Alongside the affordability of veterinary care for a lot of people, cases where animals came in with very healable, very fixable injuries. For example, an orthopedic injury, a broken leg, or something that could be remedied only with money, and the prognosis was very good. People who were desperate to provide this care, but literally just could not afford it. Maybe they couldn't even apply for these last ditch efforts, lines of credit. And there were occasions where veterinarians in the practice they couldn't bear with euthanizing an otherwise healthy pet who they knew they could help. They took on the responsibility of ownership, even just temporary ownership for these pets, and took care to treat them maybe on their own dime. Obviously a lot of the labor was their own, but that's an immense responsibility and something that I can understand a bit from working in shelter medicine. And it brings back up questions of care, euthanasia as care. Euthanasia is a form of care, but when and where that needs to be administered as care is always up for debate. And my other thought that I had lost that was coming back as you were talking about, veterinarians being tasked with studying and knowing a lot of species. But we also have to keep in mind too that beyond the species level, just as you would expect in human medicine, knowing the individual, so knowing their life, their needs, knowing, for example, what to recommend in terms of surgeries if you have a highly active dog versus a very inactive dog. I had one of my dogs who passed earlier this year, lived for several years with a neurological condition called fibrocartilaginous embolism, FCE, which affected her laterally, that she was really not able to use much of her right side, even though she went through extensive rehabilitation. She was able to kind of get up and moving from being completely unable to move. And so she made great progress, but she was always going to live a life that was less active. And when we were considering courses of treatment for her and kind of the prognosis for the rest of her life, we thought about the fact that this was a very lazy dog. She loved just lying around in the sun. She didn't really like going for walks. Like, she would just kind of get annoyed and want to turn around after a bit. This was a dog who just wanted to lie in the sun and cuddle. And so when we considered quality of life decisions for her moving forward with this neurologic deficit, it was easy. But if you had a dog who was used to hiking 7 kilometers a day or whatever, and they were faced with this same quandary, if you had a different dog, then maybe the veterinarian, maybe the doctors, this team would offer, different suggestions in terms of moving forward. And so, not only knowing species, but knowing individuals. And that all comes to client communication, not just knowing the animal body in front of you, but being able to ask the right questions to deliver the best advice for quality of life for any particular animal.
Yeah, that's a really good thing to mention. Yeah, thank you very much for that as well.
Yeah, I'm glad it came back to me. It was a couple.
So cool. Awesome. Yeah, okay, I think that's it for today. It was really lovely. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. We can talk more later, as I love to talk about this.
Yeah, is there any email address or anything that people might get in contact with you or reach you if they have further questions?
Oh, sure. My email address is just my last name, which is Hugosson, HUGOSSON @unc.edu.
Yeah, then I would say see you listeners and speak to you next time.